Picture a man standing at a podium in the Iranian parliament in the spring of 1951. He is 69 years old. He is frail enough that his aides sometimes carry him into the chamber on a stretcher. He weeps openly when he speaks, wipes his eyes with a handkerchief, and then delivers arguments so precise and so devastating that the room falls completely silent. His name is Mohammad Mosaddegh. He has just become Prime Minister of Iran, and the speech he is about to give will set in motion a chain of events whose consequences are still shaping the Middle East today. The speech was about oil, not in the vague geopolitical sense that people talk about oil today, in the literal, accountable sense, about who had it, who was taking it, and the exact terms under which a foreign corporation had been extracting the wealth underneath Iranian soil for 50 years and returning almost none of it to the people that soil belonged to. And here is the popular version of what happened next. The version that has been the official story for decades. Mosaddegh was a dangerous radical, maybe a communist, maybe a Soviet pawn. He threatened the stability of the Middle East during the most dangerous stretch of the Cold War. And the United States and Britain, however reluctantly, did what had to be done. They helped remove him before Iran fell behind the Iron Curtain, a hard choice in hard times. Messy perhaps, but necessary. That story is not true. And today we are going to open the files, follow the money, read the cables, and find out what actually happened in Tehran in August of 1953. Because the real story, the documented story, is not a Cold War tragedy. It is a corporate heist, authorized at the highest levels of the American and British governments, carried out in the streets of a foreign capital, and disguised in the language of freedom to protect the profits of a single oil company. And the cost of that heist was not paid by the men who ordered it. It was paid by generations of Iranians. And in a way that nobody in those boardrooms anticipated, it came back to be paid by the rest of the world too. Let us begin where everything in this story begins. With the oil. In 1901, a British speculator named William Knox D'Arcy persuaded the Shah of Persia, which is what Iran was called then, to grant him the exclusive right to explore for oil across almost the entire country. The deal he struck was almost comically one-sided. D'Arcy paid £16,000 up front, promised a small annual payment, and agreed to give the Persian government 16% of the net profits from whatever he found. 16%. If he found nothing, the government got nothing. If he found everything, the government got 16 cents on the dollar, and D'Arcy kept the rest. 7 years later, in May of 1908, D'Arcy's drilling crew struck oil at a place called Masjid Soliman in southwestern Persia. It was one of the largest oil deposits ever discovered at that point in history. And D'Arcy, a man who had risked other people's money on a colonial gamble, became fabulously wealthy almost overnight. The company that grew out of that discovery was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Later, it would rename itself the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and eventually, after the events of 1953, it would quietly rebrand itself under a name you will recognize instantly. British Petroleum, BP. In 1914, a young First Lord of the Admiralty named Winston Churchill made a decision that would bind Britain to Iranian oil for the next half-century. The Royal Navy was converting its warships from coal to oil. Oil was faster, more efficient, more powerful, but Britain had no significant domestic supply. Churchill arranged for the British government to purchase a majority stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The Crown was now directly invested in Iranian oil, not metaphorically invested. Financially, structurally, strategically invested in the proposition that Iranian oil belonged to a company based in London. And for the next 30 years, the arrangement functioned the way colonial arrangements always function when the weaker party has no leverage. Iran got its 16%. Britain and the company got the rest. British engineers ran the refinery at Abadan, which grew to become the largest oil refinery in the world. British managers lived in housing segregated from Iranian workers. British accountants set the terms by which profits were calculated, which meant, in practice, that the Iranian government had only the vaguest idea what it was actually owed, and no real mechanism to verify the numbers. There is one figure that tells you everything you need to know about this arrangement. In the year 1950, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company declared profits of over £170 million. Iran's share came to approximately £16 million, less than 10% of the actual profit. In the same year, the British government collected more in taxes from the company than Iran received in its entire royalty payment. The Iranians knew this. They had been complaining about it for years. In 1948 and 1949, Iran's government negotiated what was called the Supplemental Agreement, an attempt to get slightly better terms. When the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, saw what the agreement actually contained, they rejected it, not because they were radicals, because they could do arithmetic. And into that frustration stepped Mohammad Mosaddegh. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a communist. He was a Swiss-educated lawyer from an aristocratic Persian family, a constitutional nationalist who had spent his entire career fighting for the rule of law and against foreign interference in Iranian affairs. He believed in parliamentary democracy, private property, and the right of a sovereign nation to control its own resources. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man that Western governments spent the Cold War claiming to support. In April of 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The vote was unanimous. Mosaddegh, who had championed the nationalization, was elected prime minister 4 days later. The streets of Tehran filled with celebration, an act that Iranians saw as the most basic assertion of sovereignty. The right to own what lay beneath their own ground was greeted as a moment of national liberation. The British government saw it differently. They saw it as theft. More precisely, they saw it as a precedent. A contagious idea that, if it stood, might inspire Egypt to nationalize the Suez Canal, Iraq to nationalize its oil, and a dozen other countries to reclaim assets still held by British firms. The empire was already unraveling. This felt like a push. Britain's initial response was economic strangulation. It withdrew its technicians from the Abadan refinery. It organized a global boycott of Iranian oil, pressuring tanker companies, insurance firms, and petroleum distributors not to purchase oil that had been nationalized. It froze Iranian assets held in British banks, and it stationed Royal Navy warships in the Persian Gulf, making clear that any tanker attempting to leave with Iranian oil might face interception on the open water. The boycott worked. Iranian oil exports collapsed. The revenue that Mosaddegh had counted on to fund his government and to demonstrate that nationalization could actually benefit ordinary Iranians dried up almost completely. His administration found itself squeezed, unable to pay civil servants reliably, unable to fund the reforms he had promised, unable to prove that independence from Britain was financially viable. And then Britain went to Washington. Here is a detail that breaks the simple Cold War story almost immediately. The Truman administration, which was in power when the crisis began, did not want to overthrow Mosaddegh. Secretary of State Dean Acheson and the State Department pushed Britain to negotiate. They believed that Mosaddegh was a genuine nationalist, not a Soviet instrument, and that forcing him out would be counterproductive, would hand the Soviets a gift by proving that the West supported colonialism over democracy when forced to choose. The Americans sent their own mediators to Tehran. They tried to broker a deal. They genuinely, if incompletely, tried. The British rejected every proposal that would have given Iran a meaningful share of its own oil. They were not interested in a fair settlement. They wanted their company back. When Eisenhower replaced Truman in January of 1953, everything changed. The new Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. The new Director of Central Intelligence was his brother, Allen Dulles. Both brothers saw the world through a rigid Cold War lens in which any nationalist movement that challenged Western business interests was, by definition, a communist threat. And both brothers had, before entering government, worked at the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which had extensive corporate clients with interests across the developing world. The ideological and the commercial were not easily separated in that building. The British intelligence services had been lobbying for a coup since 1952. They called their plan Operation Boot. They had been expelled from Iran by Mosaddegh, who had closed the British embassy and sent all British diplomats home after the nationalization. So they came to Langley. The CIA's version was called Operation Ajax, and the man they sent to run it was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, a charming, well-connected operative who would later describe the entire operation in a memoir with a tone that sounds, to a modern ear, remarkably breezy for a project that dismantled a democracy. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran undercover in July of 1953. He carried a substantial amount of cash. The operation he ran over the following weeks was not elegant and not sophisticated. It was, in practice, a street-level purchase of a political outcome, involving newspaper editors, religious figures, mob bosses, and rented crowds. Let us be specific about the mechanics, because the specifics matter. The CIA paid Iranian newspaper editors and journalists to run anti-Mosaddegh stories, material that depicted him as a communist, a tool of the Soviets, an enemy of Islam, a threat to the Shah. The agency paid religious leaders to denounce him from their pulpits. It paid members of the Iranian parliament to withdraw their support and create the appearance of political collapse from within. The atmosphere of manufactured crisis was the point. The goal was to make Mosaddegh look like a man who had lost control, even as the men paying for the chaos controlled every element of it. And then the CIA hired the actual muscle. A general named Fazlollah Zahedi, with a history of collaboration with Nazi Germany during the Second World War, was selected as the man who would take over the government. He was the CIA's chosen successor, the acceptable face of the new order. And to put him in power, the agency contracted with the street networks of Tehran. A wrestler and strongman named Shaban Jafari, known in the bazaars as Shaban the Brainless, commanded gangs of hired men. He was the mechanism by which American foreign policy would be physically enforced on the streets of a foreign capital. On August 19, 1953, those gangs were paid and deployed. Mobs moved through the streets of Tehran, attacking pro-Mosaddegh newspapers, beating his supporters in the street, storming government buildings. Military units loyal to the Shah and to Zahedi moved on the capital simultaneously. Mossadegh's home was surrounded. Tanks fired on it directly. By nightfall, it was over. Mohammad Mosaddegh, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, was under arrest. Fazlollah Zahedi was Prime Minister. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled the country when it looked as though the first attempt might fail, returned to his throne. The CIA had spent somewhere between $1 and $5 million, depending on whose accounting you believe, to overthrow a government. Kermit Roosevelt flew home and was congratulated in person by President Eisenhower. Allen Dulles later claimed the total cost was only $265,000. Independent historians have never found that number credible. Mosaddegh was tried before a military tribunal. He was charged with treason against the Shah, a charge he rejected with contempt, arguing that he had served the Iranian nation, the Iranian constitution, and that the court trying him had no legitimate authority under the laws he had spent his life defending. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by house arrest for the remainder of his life. He died in 1967, confined to the estate outside Tehran where he had been born. He was never freed. The house became, after 1979, a quiet place of pilgrimage. Now, what happened to the oil? Because that question strips away whatever remaining ambiguity exists about what this operation was actually for. After the coup, a new oil consortium was negotiated. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which promptly rebranded as British Petroleum, received 40%. But this time, American oil companies were cut directly into the arrangement. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Saucony Vacuum, Standard Oil of California, the Texas Company, and Gulf Oil each received shares in the new consortium. The American companies had lobbied their government to be included as a condition of their support for the operation. They got what they wanted. Read that once more, carefully. American oil companies received shares in Iranian oil as part of the reward for the CIA overthrowing Iran's government. The national security apparatus of the United States was used to forcibly transfer the oil wealth of a sovereign nation into the hands of private American and British corporations. There is no charitable reading of what that is. There is only the description. Iran's share of the new arrangement was slightly improved from the original 16%. The New Deal offered a 50-50 split on paper, which sounds like progress until you understand that the Iranian government still had no independent access to the books, no ability to verify what the profits actually were, and no power to enforce the terms if the companies got creative with their accounting, which oil companies historically do. The money was real, the sovereignty was a performance, and now, the Shah. Because the Shah is the part of this story that turns a corporate crime into a generational catastrophe. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, restored to power by the United States and Britain, ruled Iran for the next 26 years. He ruled with increasing brutality as the years went on. The security service he built, known by its Persian acronym SAVAK, was organized and trained with direct assistance from the CIA and Israeli intelligence. Its methods, documented by Amnesty International across the 1970s, included systematic torture. Political prisoners were beaten, burned, subjected to electric shock, had their fingernails removed. Thousands were imprisoned without trial. Thousands more simply disappeared. The Shah's Iran was a reliable American ally, a stable source of oil, and a consistent violator of the human rights that American government officials invoked in other contexts whenever it was convenient to do so. Every American administration from Eisenhower to Carter armed him, praised him publicly, and looked away from SAVAK. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter stood beside the Shah at a state dinner in Tehran and toasted Iran as an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. 18 months later, the Shah fled the country and never returned. Because here is what the men who ordered the 1953 coup did not understand, or perhaps did not care to understand. The Iranians remembered. They remembered Mosaddegh. They remembered August 19th. They remembered the name of the company and the names of the governments that had decided that their democratically expressed choice did not matter as much as British Petroleum's contract. And what filled the vacuum when the Shah fell was not another moderate nationalist like Mosaddegh. The moderate nationalists had been broken. The secular left had been destroyed. 26 years of SAVAK had eliminated every organized opposition except the one that operated underground, in the mosques, in the religious networks that the secret police could not fully penetrate. The revolution of 1979 brought Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini to power, and Khomeini had a phrase he used to describe the two great enemies of Iran, a phrase that echoed through the revolutionary movement and became official doctrine of the Islamic Republic. The great Satan he called America. The little Satan he called Britain. He had his reasons. They were rooted in 1953, and then, in November of 1979, a group of students seized the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. They held them for 444 days. The hostage crisis transformed American politics, destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency, and set in motion a confrontation between the United States and Iran that has continued in various forms for more than 4 decades. The students who took the embassy called it the den of spies. When they went through the files inside, they found shredded documents that they painstakingly reassembled over months and then published. Some of what they found confirmed what many Iranians had believed for years about the extent of CIA activity in their country. The documents became exhibits in an argument about sovereignty and intervention that has never been resolved. The hostage crisis led to a rupture in American-Iranian relations that still exists today. It contributed to American support for Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, a war that killed hundreds of thousands of people on both sides, and which Iran entered still internally destabilized by everything that had preceded it. The downstream consequences of the 1953 coup spread outward across decades like rings from a stone dropped in deep water. Iran's nuclear program, which has driven international tensions for most of the 21st century, is partly a product of this history. Iranian leaders who grew up in the shadow of 1953 and 1979 draw a direct lesson from those events. Countries that depend on the goodwill of great powers for their security lose their sovereignty the moment that goodwill evaporates. Nuclear capability is the one form of deterrence that outside powers cannot simply buy their way around with oil money and rented mobs. Now let us be precise about what the evidence actually shows, because precision is what this story requires. The CIA's own internal history of Operation Ajax, written in 1954 by agency historian Donald Wilbur, was declassified in 2013. It is a remarkable document to read. Wilbur, writing from the inside for an internal audience, describes the mechanics of the operation with bureaucratic frankness. The subornation of journalists, the rental of mobs, the payments to military officers, the choreography of what appeared to be a popular uprising, but was, in every documented detail, a staged performance funded from Langley. The document does not describe a reluctant intervention undertaken to save democracy from communism. It describes a project undertaken to protect commercial interests, executed through bribery and coordinated violence, and then wrapped retroactively in Cold War justification once the outcome had been secured. The British documents tell the same story from a different angle. A Foreign Office assessment from 1953, released decades later, noted with some candor that the fundamental issue was oil, that the political and strategic arguments were important supporting rationales, but that the actual trigger was the nationalization of a British company, and the threat that a successful precedent might spread to other British commercial interests across the developing world. This is what makes the Cold War explanation so durable and so misleading. It is not entirely false. Iran was a strategically important country. The Soviet Union was real. There were Iranian communists, organized in the Tudeh Party, who might have benefited from extended chaos. These were genuine factors, but they were not the driving factor. They were the available justification for a decision that had already been made on commercial and imperial grounds, a justification pulled from the shelf, because it was the one that would travel well in Washington, in the press, and in the history books. Mosaddegh himself had specifically invited American investment in Iranian oil. He wanted American involvement precisely as a counterweight to British dominance. He was not anti-Western, he was anti-monopoly. He wanted Iran to sell its oil freely on the international market, to multiple buyers, on transparent and verifiable terms. The idea that this man was a Soviet stalking horse required a kind of willful blindness that only makes sense if you understand that the actual goal was not to stop the Soviets, but to restore the company. The same pattern, the same structure of commercial motivation dressed in Cold War language, appeared repeatedly in the years that followed 1953. In Guatemala in 1954, the CIA overthrew the democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz because his government had moved to redistribute land held by the United Fruit Company. Cold War justifications were produced. The underlying motive was commercial. In Chile in 1973, the CIA supported the coup that brought Augusto Pinochet to power. One of the driving American concerns was the nationalization of copper mines operated by American companies. Cold War justifications were produced. The pattern is not coincidence. It is a system in which the language of security was used to perform the work of profit. And here is where the evidence leaves us, stated with the precision the story deserves. Did the United States and Britain overthrow the democratic government of Iran in 1953? Yes. The CIA's own declassified documents confirm it without meaningful ambiguity. Was the primary motivation to stop Soviet communism? No. The primary motivation, documented in British Foreign Office cables and CIA operational histories, was to protect the commercial interests of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and to establish an oil arrangement that included American firms. Was Mosaddegh a communist? No. He was a constitutional nationalist who had spent his career defending parliamentary democracy and who explicitly welcomed American investment as an alternative to British monopoly. Did the coup have lasting consequences? The 1979 revolution, the hostage crisis, the 40-year rupture in American-Iranian relations, the Iran-Iraq war, the ongoing confrontation over nuclear capability. These are the consequences. They are still unresolved. The Cold War cover story was not just wrong. It was operational. It was designed to be wrong, designed to provide a usable justification for something that could not survive examination on its actual merits. The same governments that talked about freedom and democracy and self-determination removed the freedom, democracy, and self-determination of a nation of 20 million people to protect the bottom line of an oil company. And then they were surprised when the Iranians were angry about it. The lesson that the architects of Operation Ajax thought they were teaching was that American power could manage the developing world, could redirect nationalist movements that threatened corporate interests, install manageable governments, and maintain strategic order without ever acknowledging what the order was actually being managed for. The lesson they actually taught was something different. That American declarations about democracy were conditional. That American support came with terms. That sovereignty was something the United States claimed for itself while denying it to others whenever the price was right. That lesson, absorbed in August of 1953, was noted by every government in the developing world that was watching. It was absorbed by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. It was absorbed by Jawaharlal Nehru in India. It was absorbed by a young Cuban lawyer named Fidel Castro, who drew from the events of 1953 and 1954. A very specific conclusion about what accommodation with American commercial interests meant for the independence of a small country. The world the coup makers thought they were securing was not secured. It came apart 26 years later in a revolution they had made inevitable by eliminating everyone who might have offered a less radical alternative. And there is a final irony worth sitting with, because this story is full of ironies, and this one is the sharpest. The company at the center of all of it, the company whose profits the United States and Britain overthrew a democracy to protect, is now called BP, British Petroleum. Its most famous recent moment in American memory is the Deepwater Horizon explosion in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, which killed 11 workers and spilled nearly 5 million barrels of oil into the water, making it the largest marine oil spill in the history of the United States. The company was not saved by the 1953 coup. It was given more time to extract, more time to profit, more time to operate in the space cleared for it by men who decided that the oil mattered more than the government sitting above it. Mosaddegh died under house arrest. The company he tried to nationalize rebranded and moved on. The country he tried to liberate is still living with the consequences of the August day, when the CIA decided that Iranian democracy was a problem that money could solve. The map of the modern Middle East was not drawn by destiny or by the will of its people. It was drawn, again and again, by frightened men making decisions in boardrooms and cabinet rooms, wrapping commercial interest in the language of security, and then presenting the results to history as necessity. And the bill, as always, was paid by the people who were never asked. If you stayed to the end of this one, leave a candle in the comments, just so I know who was here for the whole story. If you believe that history told honestly, with the documents open and the myths pulled apart, is worth your time, then subscribe, because that is exactly what we do here, week after week. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.